Hockey Inside Out, presented to you by The Gazette.
Welcome to the Hockey Inside Out show. We start this week's episode passing our condolences along to Jean Belivau's family. The Canadiens legend passed away last night, age 83. I'm joined today by Arpan Basu from NHL.com, Jack Todd, and Christopher Curtis from The Gazette. Jack, what did Jean Beliveau mean to this organization?
You know, I was thinking about it this morning, and there's something. The Canadiens as a franchise are different than any other franchise in the sport. We know that. But there's more to it than just the 24 Stanley Cups. They do things in a different way. There have been lapses when the organization fell down a bit. But they've always been held to a higher standard. And I think the reason for that is Jean Beliveau. He, you know, people say, well, he was one of the two greatest players in franchise history, whatever. Beliveau is the Canadiens. He made them what they are. Without Beliveau, maybe you're looking at 18 Stanley Cups, 19. The number doesn't matter. The point is, with Beliveau, they stood above the rest of hockey, above the rest of the world of sports, just because of the class of the man, the impact that he had on society as a whole. I think the reason you'd look at this as the absolute Cadillac of sports organizations today is because of Jean Beliveau. On
and off the ice. Now, Arpan, you weren't born, I don't think, when Jean Belivau's career ended, but what's your thoughts on the man you've dealt with him?
Well, I think, you know, I mean, speaking, like, furthering to what Jack was saying is that, you know, you always, whenever I went to cover a game, I would always make a point to look in those two seats behind the Canadiens bench to see Jean and Elise Beliveau and make sure they're there. And there was just a certain sense of comfort that came with that. But to further to what Jack was saying is that, I mean, you imagine as a Canadiens player, you're coming back to the bench and you're having a poor effort and you had a bad shift and you look up and Jean Beliveau sitting there, probably a little disappointed.
He wouldn't even have to say a word, right?
You know, he wouldn't have to say it. I mean, you just look at this guy who is just, you know, the epitome of everything that you would strive to be as a person, as a player and everything, and then say, okay, well, you know, I really didn't give it my best that shift. So there was a certain presence to him, a presence of excellence that I think did resonate to the players, to the coaches, to the GMs, to everyone around the organization. And he is really the one guy. I mean, when you become a sports reporter and you're a huge sports fan your whole life, you know, there's a certain sense of awe about the whole thing and everything, but eventually it wears off. You realize these people are just people and oftentimes are, you know, not the best of people either. But, you know, Jean Beliveau is the one person who that sense of awe never left me. I was literally scared of the man. He did nothing that would make you afraid of him. He was a warm, welcoming, you know, generous person with his time. But for as long as he was coming around the Bell Center, he is the one person that just intimidated me the entire time, just because you knew you were in the presence of greatness. And it was like, I just felt that I better have something really good to say if I'm going to go up and talk to Jean Beliveau.
I mean, if he had run for Prime Minister, he would have won, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because we only know, or my generation, we only really know of Beliveau as Beliveau the statesman, you know? And Beliveau, as a testament to the kind of man he was once offered a seat in the Senate. He declined. Was then offered by Prime Minister Jean Chrétien to become Governor General, and he said no. And when you think of the people who have gorged themselves on all of this free money and haven't maybe been deserving of these kinds of titles, it takes a very special, a very humble, it takes a guy like Jean Beliveau to say, you know what, that's not me, or I don't feel comfortable with that. I mean, who does that, you know? And especially in this day and age, some of the athletes we see, I mean, you're in awe of that.
Listening to the radio this morning, Brian Williams was in Vancouver, he was talking on TSN radio, waiting for a ferry, and he said everybody in Vancouver was talking about waiting for the ferry on the radio was Jean Beliveau. He goes beyond Montreal, he goes beyond Canada. One of the best descriptions I've ever heard of Beliveau was actually written by Steve Rushin of Sports Illustrated, who wrote years ago, he said, "A ceremonial first puck was dropped by Canadiens legend Jean Beliveau, resplendent in a perfectly tailored suit, his silver coif immaculate. If God had a $500 haircut, he'd look like this," which is a classic line. Beneath 24 Stanley Cup banners, Beliveau gave a regal half wave. There were 21,273 people in the stands, and we all roared like the MGM Lion. My skin, I noticed, was pebbled like a plucked chicken's. And this is an American rating.
Oh, he could do that to you. I mean, just meeting the man. I had to go to the old Forum to do a feature on Sarah Savard in the late 80s. And as part of the feature, I was interviewing Beliveau. I spent about 45 minutes in his office talking to him. And, you know, you're first, maybe like Arpan, that feeling of being a little afraid that you're in the presence of Jean Beliveau. But nobody could have had more of the common touch. He put you completely at ease immediately. And, you know, you forget that even at the end of his career, this guy went into Boston when the Canadiens were getting hammered in 1971. They were down 5-1. Who got them going on the comeback? Jean Beliveau. His last cup, you know, in an impossible situation. Maybe it was because he was the one player in the league that was so respected the Bruins wouldn't run him. But, you know, even at the end of his career, he was able to do that physically on the ice. Off the ice, the man is beyond anybody as far as pure, untrammeled respect. Beliveau spent 60 or 65 years in the public eye without a bad word ever being said.
Never a hair
him.
out of place, never made a mistake.
Exactly.
He will be greatly missed.
Yep.
Again, our condolences to Jean Belivau's family and all Canadiens fans. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to the Hockey Inside Out Show. Arpon Basu, the managing editor of LNH.com, the French version of the NHL website. Arpon, what is your role with the NHL website?
Well, basically, I manage the content that appears on the French version of the website. It's a site we launched 3 years ago in November, and just basically provides, you know, a lot of similar content to what you see on NHL.com. I make sure I get it translated, but I pick and choose what will resonate well in this market with Francophones. Try to focus on some of the Francophone players around the league, but really what we try to do is kind of fill the void in the Quebec media about the rest of the National Hockey League. A lot of, you know, obviously the Canadiens get covered to death, and we obviously cover the Canadiens a fair bit, but we, you know, I always felt that there was sort of a lack of coverage of the rest of the National Hockey League available to fans in French. And when you think about the recent history of the Canadiens, and I don't know if they have such an exclusivity on the Francophone market as they used to, and so I think there are a lot of fans out there that are underserved, fans of the Colorado Avalanche, the Boston Bruins, if you can believe that, teams like the Ottawa Senators. So we try and fill that void and provide some news on their favorite teams that might not be Montreal.
No. Brendan Gallagher, Jack, signed a new 6-year, $22.5 million contract. He's 22 years old. The way he plays, is he going to be still walking?
Well, he's survived so far. That's amazed me. He's a pretty durable little rock considering the beating that he takes every night. I think it was a great signing. I said it says something about him that, you know, this is a sizable contract, signed in mid-season, which the Habs never used to do, and yet you heard no complaints in the media or among the fans. Everybody loves the guy. Get him signed long term.
I mean, I think Marc Bergevin's biggest compliment came. Pierre LeBrun tweeted out that a GM texted him after hearing the contract deal and asked if the cap hit was a misprint. So I don't think there's a bigger compliment for Marc Bergevin on this contract than that.
Well, on the money side, Gallagher, the way it breaks down, he's going to make $5.5 million next season, which is $1.5 million more than Max Pacioretty's going to make. Moving forward, Chris, do you see any issues with Max being upset about being underpaid?
Pacioretty's already fired his agent, so he's taken care of that. If we want to remain with Gallagher here for a second, I think what one of the things that amazes me about Gallagher is so many of the other players, you kind of picture them struggling to find their identity on the team. I don't think Gallagher's staying up at night wondering what his job is going to be the next day. He does it with this single-mindedness that's just so impressive. Go to the net. Go to the net, get punched in the face, get beat up, go to the net.
In the blue paint, I keep saying some paint company needs to get a sponsorship deal with him for the different shades of blue.
But that's what makes him so consistent, right? Like, I really, honestly, he's been here, this is his third season, right, with the team, and so I cannot think, I mean, I can count on one hand the number of times I've finished a game and thought, you know, Brendan Gallagher had a bad game tonight. Yeah. Like, it really, you never think that, only because of that single-mindedness. Like, he knows what he has to do. It doesn't matter who he plays with. It doesn't matter what role he's in. He knows that that's his job and that's what he does. But it takes, you know, it takes some serious mental fortitude to be able to get yourself up to do that night in, night out, and know the abuse that you're going to take, and willingly put yourself in the face of that abuse and seemingly enjoy it. And get up with
a smile on his face.
Well, as Michael Farber said, he said, you know, Michel Therrien needs to remind himself to talk with Brendan because his weeks will go by, he won't say anything because he just does everything right. Now, somebody who's a whipping boy, especially on the HIO site, is DD or David Desharnais. What do we do? Is that contract tradable? What does Marc Bergevin do?
I don't think it is tradable. I think part of the reason he's whipped, the contract aside, is that people say, well, he's not a number one center. Well, no, he's not. he's Max Pacioretty's center.
Yeah.
You know, and that's why he is where he is. The Canadiens should more or less at least have 3 pretty equal lines. If they give a little power play time to Lars Eller, they would. But I think they're picking on him because they're saying, well, he's not Andrei Kopitar, he's not Sidney Crosby, he's not Evgeny Malkin. Of course he isn't. You know, he's at best a third-line center in a normal structure. So in that sense, in the structure of the team, the complaints are unfounded. In the contract, it probably is one of the few areas where Bergevin has set a foot wrong.
That Pacioretty and Desharnais relationship sort of reminds that movie Twins. Remember with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito that go around. They gotta be. But can you win with David Desharnais as your #1 center going forward?
Well, I don't really see another option. Do you want him on the third line? You know, do you want him playing a more physical brand? I think the third line's rolling great the way it is with Lars Eller at center. It's just where he is. You can't put him anywhere else. You can't. You know, you couldn't put him on the fourth. That would, you know, create a mutiny. You can't. You know, you can't have him on the second. They've already got their thing going, so he's on the first. For better or worse, it's just where he is.
The one thing that's really, the power play is struggling so much. And
Yeah.
if you look at the ice time, the overall ice time on the power play this year for forwards, Max Pacioretty is first at 63 minutes, just over 63. David Desharnais at 62. Lars Eller's had 5 minutes and 57 seconds on the power play all season.
Well, that's the one thing that I think Michel Therrien has failed to address as far as his power play is concerned. He's tried a whole bunch of different schemes. And one of the key issues for the power play all season has been their zone entries. They've just been unable to enter the zone cleanly. And a reason for that is because they tend to want to create battle situations when it comes to puck retrieval. I mean, a lot of times they don't have any schemes in the neutral zone to try and enter the zone with possession of the puck, and so they'll dump it in or do strategic chips into certain areas of the ice. And that's where Desharnais kind of hurts you, is because in those situations, in those 50-50 battles, in the past, he's won a lot. He's won more than you would think for a guy his size. But this season, he hasn't won too many. And I would love to see something on his turnover rate on the power play, because I think it's been pretty high this year.
And it's too bad the Canadiens couldn't find another Jean Beliveau to fill that #1 center role. We'll be right back again after a short break. Welcome back to the Hockey Inside Out show. Jack Radies did a fantastic documentary this week on Saku Koivu, another former captain of the Canadiens. Your thoughts about Saku and with the passing of Jean Beliveau, any comparisons, any similarities between the two?
You know, in many ways, that position as the team's #1 centerman and classiest individual was filled by Saku, as well as probably anyone since Jean Beliveau retired. Obviously, they don't really compare as players. Saku was a fine player, but he was never on a par with Beliveau. I think in many ways, most of what Saku did, he never got credit for because he did it well away from the cameras. You know, he was so helpful with cancer victims, so many people he called, spoke to, signed things for, that, you know, no one ever saw. But as a person, he was much more reserved than Beliveau. He was a bit standoffish, a bit Finnish, if you will, you know. And I think for that reason, many Quebecois did not respond to him the same way. It wasn't just that he wasn't from Quebec. It was also just that slightly different kind of personality.
He was also on a team that wasn't very good as a leader.
Yeah. He was terrible sometimes.
Yeah, he got a bit of a raw deal when you think about his decade as captain of the team. I do seem to remember this one particular moment where there was a controversy about, you know, Saku doesn't speak any French. It just came out of nowhere. It's one of those stories that happens when the team isn't doing well and we need to drum up controversial stories in the media. And he didn't really, he responded to it the best way you could. I think the next video appearance he made above the Bell Center, he said a few words in French. And that was that, you know?
One of the interesting things from the documentary I found was when they were interviewing Michel Therrien, who was coach back then when Saku came back from his cancer. And Therrien said he couldn't stand behind the bench when he came back out because he was so emotional. He had to go back into his office and compose himself. Just your thoughts on Saku?
Well, I mean, that night was easily the most emotion-packed night that I've covered in my career. I've been covering the team since 2000, and that was, 2 years later. And I think that night sort of, when you talk about the comparisons with Beliveau, and no one would dream to compare the two players, but as a man, I think they are somewhat comparable in the sense that, Jack said earlier that Jean Beliveau was the Canadiens. However, to an entire generation of Canadiens fans, Saku Koivu was the Canadiens. He was the guy that they looked to, who was the one constant, who always gave his top effort in every situation, was placed in a situation to not succeed and succeeded regardless of that. So to the younger generation of fans now, people probably a little bit younger than I am, but people who have never really experienced their team winning a Stanley Cup, never really experienced the Canadiens being an elite top team, Saku Koivu was their guy. And so to that generation, I think he probably does hold a certain same kind of esteem as Jean Beliveau does, in the sense of like this classy, kind of demure, great leader. And I know people might think that's somewhat sacrilegious, especially in the wake of Mr. Belivau's passing, but I think the impact was probably comparable.
Now, December 18th, the Canadiens are going to honor Saku before a game against Anaheim. What do they do? I mean, it's a tough
I
one,
don't
right?
I don't think they retire his number.
No.
I don't see that happening. That's a very high standard to get
I think
your,
you need to be a Hall of
banner
Famer.
up there.
That-
Yeah,
that needs to be-
absolutely.
to be in that
But I don't think that will happen. Probably through no fault of his own that they didn't win a cup. He arrived here. He'd barely gotten his feet wet when they fired Serge Savard, Jacques Demers, etc., and
They
just
traded
sent the
Patrick
organization.
Watt 2 months after his debut.
Yeah,
Patrick Watt was
exactly.
gone.
He's barely gotten started here when the whole organization basically is falling apart. And he was for a long time he was about the only thread holding it together. But for that reason, I think in that company probably no number to the roof.
Yeah. Well, December 2nd marked the 19th anniversary of Wa's last game with the Canadiens. Do we ever see him coming back here as coach of the Canadiens?
Well, no, not. He's not a really good coach right now. I mean, if you look at his team, so I don't know. I don't know if
But
he's
he lost in his
candidate.
version of Patrick.
He can't coach without a goalie anymore than Mario
Any of these
Tremblay
coaches could,
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see the relationship between Carey Price and Patrick Waugh.
Oh
That could be
boy,
fun. Couldn't
I
have
can't
two
imagine
people
it.
more opposite.
Honestly, I think Patrick in this market is just a bad fit. It would be contentious from day one. It would be great for people like myself who write columns because there'd be crap every day. But I don't think the city needs him, and I definitely don't think he needs this city.
It's just so combustible. I mean, it feels like his solution to everything is like, yeah, I think that fire needs more gas. More gas. There's a bluster there that just isn't necessary,
Although he has seemed to calm down a bit, it might have to do with the fact he probably deals with 3 or 4 media people a day in Denver instead of
I
instead of the
think
whole
he's genuinely different, though. I mean, you talk to some of the Avalanche players, and he's a really chill guy. He's never blown up at his team. And even now, in the midst of this horrible season, he's been totally calm and collected. Like the guys on his team swear by that. The fact that he has never blown a gasket on them.
He's gotten all the violence out of his system.
Yeah,
just
that's it.
all of it out of his system.
On that note, we'll say thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Hockey Inside Out Show. And again, our condolences go out to Jean Beliveau's family.